here, but officially will be on at 7 o'clock as promised, which is in 7 minutes. Saying hi to Jackson and Savannah, who will be reporting in a few minutes' time on the wonderful experience they had at the rock show and also at a creationist table. But I was about ready to pontificate in my usual smug, arrogant way. That one of the big things is to have a giant blind spot on is what I call the map of time. I don't really have an idea of what went on in the past. This doesn't matter whether they're young Earth creationists or intelligent designers. And so they bandy about terms like the Cambrian explosion, and without really having a visceral sense of what happened next and this and this and this and where everything lived and what everything looked like and how different everything was. So in any debate with an anti-evolutionist, you're going to have to realize that your audience will not have that information in their heads. And so either by direct discussion or ways to inveigle it in the course of things, you want to bring that out. One of the tricks I do is the portable map of time, which I've done as a lecture, where you can use any physical venue to illustrate the time stream. And you can pick the far wall and make that the beginning of life on Earth. And you go the other wall, and that's now. And you can tell how so much is known on the now wall down to the species level and the ecology and genetics. And the moment you get into the this happened before in the fossils, suddenly, whoop, you start losing the information stream. And now you get just a bunch of little blips on the scope. And you can easily do it. The proportions are relatively simple because you've got the sweep from the beginning of life to now is about 4 billion years. So if you just divide up the hall or whatever venue you're going to use into quadrants, which are easy to do, you've got roughly 1 billion years each. That means you aren't really hitting cyanobacteria until about halfway through. Then you hit the beginnings of Metazoans about 1 billion years ago. So that's 3/4 of a way. And then about half of that, that's where the Cambrian explosion is. So you can create a visual frame moving physically across the space to give a sense of what's going on as you're explaining stuff and putting that into a map of time that you can carry around in your head and you can use anywhere. You don't need a PowerPoint, you don't need a projector system, you don't need to have a blackboard, a chalk thing, you use that. In the same way the reptile mammal transition, you can use the bones of your own body. You don't have to require props. You carry them with you. I think that you have that you can play off. You could do it at a table, because you could do exactly the same trick with one side of the table, beginning of life, or the other side of the table now, and you could start mapping these things off and plug them in to find out what they think they know versus what you really need to have them know. And your audience, if they aren't coming into that frame knowing what they're talking about, they're just words. They're just blah, blah, blah. And it's important to reflect. You can go off in minutiae about why it's called the Cambrian as opposed to something else, a name for a mountain. As most of those places are either named for mountains or valleys, because that's where they dug up the rocks the first time, and that was the first kid on the block to see it. Blah, blah, blah.
Neander Valley.
So yeah. And same thing with the Neanderthal. Why? It's because of the Neander Valley. There's reasons why that.
I read something, they changed the spelling of valley, which is tall, from, was it T-H-A-L to T-A-L?
Well, no, it's because of the way the Germans spell. They have the TH spelling, but it's not pronounced. It's pronounced T, tal. And clods who are English would look at that and go Neanderthal when it's pronounced Neanderthal, in the same way that it's pronounced Wien, not Vienna. It's Volkswagen, not Volkswagen. That they spell differently. And so sometimes you'll find the technical. Sometimes the technical. Oh, somebody's saying something.
No. Savannah's a German student.
And Arabic.
Yes, yeah. I had to learn German to fulfill my language requirements in college, because I technically squeaked into college without having had any languages in high school. I still don't know how the hell I did it. I don't know. Maybe because I was otherwise a straight A student, so I was able to work through. But anyway, and that was the one language that I thought I could manage without my tongue breaking, because I heard the French people going, oh, and I go, no, I don't want to do that. No. After it sounds so romantic. So you learned the French Französisch. Yes, du sprichst Französisch. with the Germans, with all the thing about the oddly, you get into this with like Bernstein and Bernstein. It's because the French and the French and Germans would have reverse ways of spelling ei, and so that throws everybody off in terms of the phonetics. And it's a reason why English has so many spelling weirdity, because we steal words from languages that have different spelling conventions. So English, which is largely a Germanic language by its various roots, Anglo-Saxon and all of that, has a different spelling convention than the French. And we would start stealing words from the French in the 13th, 14th centuries and on, and we would keep their spelling, but that's not how you pronounce it. The reason why Spokane, Washington has an E on the back end is because they thought Spokan, which is phonetic for the Spokane Indians, sounded not fancy enough. So they put an E on the end, and generations of people would pronounce it Spokane because it rhymes with Citizen Kane and all the rest, because in French, putting an E on the end of something makes the vowel long. Oops.
Le français,
we are about ready to go for showtime here. I'll do a brief introduction of you kids, and then we'll be, unbelievably, it'll be largely a conversation with you talking, not me, hopefully, to tell all the things that you experienced. And I will be eventually prodding for questions to fill in what you all saw in relation to the creationists. So
we will take questions for a Q&A session.
We are going live. I am here with another one of RJ's fabulous live show discussions of things that are relevant to the things that we think are relevant. And Jackson, Wheat, and Savannah, who I don't know your last name, but we'll leave you as Savannah unless you wish to say otherwise, girlfriend, had a wonderful visit to a rock show in Louisiana. I guess it's in Louisiana. You can tell us more about it. And they encountered a creationist there. So Jackson and Savannah.
Yeah, we went to this show because I really enjoy going to it, and it is a annual thing that they have in Bossier at the Bossier Civic Center, and so I really enjoyed going to them. I've gotten some really neat stuff in the past, and so unfortunately it occurred 2 days after. No,
we got to college.
Yeah, 3 days after we got to college.
So we had to drive 4 hours back.
3 days later, 4 hours. No,
roughly the distance from Spokane to Seattle. So I know that level of ride. What, 280 miles, something like that?
Yeah, about. I think it's 264, maybe.
Something. It's around there.
Yeah, so that's about a 4-hour drive on the interstate here.
So yeah, we got here in Baton Rouge on Wednesday. We left on Friday evening with a friend of ours. We went to the convention got up, went to the convention, stayed there for a little while, and then headed back later that day. And so we took my sister there. She's pretty young, and so we get there, and also we were hoping they had this whole raffle thing that was going on. So you get a ticket when you get in there, and you put it in a little raffle, and you could potentially win this just monumental Orthoceras rock.
It was huge.
It was so large.
Because I'm not a rock hound, please explain what you just said.
An Orthoceras are these Paleozoic squid-like animals, more closely related to nautiluses, but they have a
the ammonites?
Shell. No, they're like
the straight shell ammonites.
Yeah, the straight shell ones. Yeah, they're Orthoceras. So
yeah,
they had this gigantic rock because a lot of these guys are found in Morocco, and so they're in these beautiful black crystals, just so pretty. I actually have quite a few.
They look kind of like long, thin ice cream cones, if memory serves me.
Yeah, so we were hoping to win the raffle, but unfortunately, I don't think we won it because it ended say at 5.
Yeah, around 5 o'clock, we were sitting next to our phones, making sure they were charged and the ringers were on. We wanted it so bad.
Man, we could have mounted that thing for the kid. That was for the adult raffle. For the kid raffle, they had a small mosasaur jaw, which I actually already have a mosasaur jaw. But it'd still be cool to have another one, I think.
Which were marine reptiles during the Mesozoic, just to clue everybody in on the fiddly bit things.
Yeah. Oh, hey, there's Peter. Hey, Peter. And so we went in and we were looking around. We went over to this big table nearest to the door first, and this guy had a whole bunch of stuff. He had a whole bunch of crystals and fossils, and I noticed immediately that he had these two big trilobites on display. These two really big trilobites, each were about dinner plate size, and one was $50, the other was $75, and I said, "Holy crap, this is inexpensive!" And so I got one of the trilobites and said that to him, and he said, "I'll honor our deal, but I'm gonna make this other one $100 now," because it was just kind of a mistake on his part to make them so cheap for that size. It was really big.
Yeah, large trilobites of that size. Your typical trilobite are much more holding your hand size. So those are kind of the mega ones on there. It'd be fun to have 40 or somebody. There's a guy on Twitter that I follow that's a big trilobite paleontologist, and he sticks up long strings of tweets about them every once in a while. If you're a trilobite in that, you should probably follow him too.
So we did that. So we got a whole bunch of stuff. We got a mammoth toe bone. We got a partial tyrannosaur leg bone, which was also fairly inexpensive, given that you don't come by T-Rexes very often.
So some damn tyrannosaur is walking around without a damn leg bone with a little crutch.
Yep, that's what happened. There were a whole bunch of stuff. There was one booth we saw fairly early on that was like God's fingerprint or something. Remember the jewelry booth?
Perhaps it was called.
It was like God's fingerprint or something like that.
That particular booth also sells jewelry at gun shows at the same location, though. So
yep,
they're just a jewelry.
Well, in some cases they're the same demographic clientele, so that wouldn't be surprising.
Yeah. So we were going around, making our way over there. Eventually,
making our way downtown.
Yeah, we were making our way through, weaving through the rows and rows of booths and whatnot and tables. And
he was actually busy talking to someone, and I noticed the booth with the creationist lady at it, and it said like,
oh yeah, I remember.
What did it say? It said dinosaurs, ye dragons at the top, and I was like, no, can't be.
Dinosaurs and dragons in the Bible.
Oh, can be.
I was talking to, that was the guy who sold me the T-Rex fossil, because he also had on his table this huge, absolutely gorgeous stingray fossil. Just this amazingly well preserved stingray fossil, and there were even some little there were even some, what were they? Little fish. I don't think they were Nidia, because a lot of people had Nidia, but I don't think that's what they were.
Oh yeah, a dime a dozen. People are always having those out.
Yeah, I actually have a nice square with an Nidia, and it's about that. So yeah, this beautifully preserved stingray. The whole thing went for $1,000. But I'd
much rather look at write pretty pictures and then go to the museum and see for all the stuff for free. It's actually a lot of technical work in recent years on the evolution of stingrays and the whole shark line and that. That's I imagine the person selling the thing did not study. Yeah. So there were actually several booths there run by creationists, all separate ones, or
I don't know if God's fingerprints was a necessarily creationist one. Let me see.
The gods, the reference to the gods part on there is a potential clue.
I mean, I don't know if they were.
They certainly weren't saying anything, and
no.
And their jewelry, some of it were like jeweled crosses or cross pins or whatever, but there were also booth selling fossils that had pins of the same nature, so it wasn't like anything in your face at all. If they weren't there for that purpose.
Requirements in the case of the county fair here, even though religion booths are allowed, they have very strict things about proselytizing and talking with people. There's all sorts of little strictures in place, and if this was essentially more of a trade show, I had a moderator, Jackson. Sure.
Do you know how to do it?
Is he trying to get in? And where I don't see a notation here. Where is he trying to get in to where I've?
No, he's not trying to get in. Okay, so you go to where he makes his comments, and if you go to the right, there are three little
Oh, yeah.
dots. And so you
Yeah.
click where it
Oh,
says,
yeah. I'm happy to do that. Absolutely.
okay, cool,
Done
thanks.
this once before. There we go.
Thank you.
And now I
Because
remember how to do that. Thank you for jumping in on that.
yeah, I just wanted to point that out. So yeah, so I was talking with that guy, and was it Alex who noticed it first?
No, I noticed it.
Okay, so
And
Savannah
I was
noticed
like,
it
Alex,
first,
oh my goodness.
and so she told my sister Alex, and Alex came over to me and said, Jackson, there's a sign over here that says dinosaurs and dragons in the Bible. And I thought, what? And so I looked over in the corner. Surely enough, there it was. So we continued to weave our way through the tables, and eventually we got over there because we had to get over there and see what was up. So they had some, I don't actually know, they had some really nice displays on the very end of the wall, the very far wall. I don't know if any of those were for sale though.
They weren't. It was like
Just for show.
Yeah, it was just for show. I don't know whose collection it was, but
they were very nice. They had some big teeth and whatnot. There's actually the guy with the stingray skeleton actually had like some almost entire bison occidentalis jaws, which were very nice, very nicely preserved. And so eventually we did get over there. We got over there, and I looked at it, just kind of mouth agape for a minute or two at the absurdity.
thankfully, whenever we went over there, she was busy talking to some man, I think, and she was giving him all these papers and everything, and they were deep in conversation. So Jackson had quite the opportunity just to look at her poster board and read through it and read through what was on the desk and things like that before her attention was actually focused on anyone in our group.
Yeah, as I told you, her poster said the Earth is 6,000 years old. Dinosaurs were on Noah's Ark, and the average dinosaur size was that of a sheep. So
it seemed so absurd to me initially. Like, she has on a poster board the Earth is 6,000 years old in an arena where everyone is making their money off of, ancient, for all intents and purposes, gemstones or fossils, and it just seemed absurd. It would have been a more defensible position for her to be an old Earth creationist who believed in like creation of evolution, who also believed that you could be a Christian and wanted to propose that. But just being a young Earth creationist in that space seems so absurd.
yeah, it should have been completely indefensible, but I guess the prospect just went over her head. So
yeah, it'd be fun to a methods question on that chart right off the bat would be, average dinosaur size, that of a sheep. Who figured that out? How did you do that? And that would be an opening, and would have been interesting to see whether she had any idea of how they arrived at that air quotes calculation.
Didn't you ask her that?
No, I don't think I asked her about the dinosaur size. The first thing I noticed. I just wanted to go like line by line on her board. So that was when I asked her, "Hey, if you think," or I said, "Well, what is the reason you think they're 6,000 years old?" Of course, she didn't tell me anything. She didn't reference any scientific papers or books or anything. Well, she referenced one book in particular. She said she gave the old, if you look at the chronologies and you add them up, then blah blah blah, you get 6,000 years old, which actually isn't true, depending on which creationist you ask. But
if you live in the 17th century, it's cutting edge science.
Yeah, but I mean, we also recognize that women weren't counted as progeny, so it's like we don't know if these guys were actually directly. It's like, what are the odds that every single one of them just had a male child and then they got married to some other woman? It's like, no, the females weren't seen as equals, and so they weren't going to add them into the chart and all that jazz. But yeah, so I said, okay, assuming that's true, outside of the Bible, what reason do you have to believe that? And she basically said, oh, I believe it. If I remember correctly, she just said, yeah, I believe it. And I said, so that was when I responded with, oh, so you, oh, go ahead.
Oh, you're good. You can finish your thought.
Okay, that was when I responded with, so you ignore biogeography, genetics, embryology, and the fossil record.
Yeah. So at this point, I was feeling pretty bad because I was like, oh man, this lady, she looks like a nice lady who just volunteered with this from her church or something. And, I really feel bad because Jackson's about to tear her up and, he's going to
use a variety of words that it's unlikely she will have read much about in her probably very little reading that she had done.
Yes, exactly. And so I felt bad. And then I realized, she came out here with the sign to support this ideology and this position to defend it. Exactly. We don't know where she was from, but she was nonetheless defending this position. And so if Jackson has information opposing that and she is upset by that information, then that's on her because she put herself in a position to discuss the position.
If you're going to put forward material as though it were science, the interesting thing that I honed in on right off the bat was the fact that she had 2 books there. So give us a little fill-in about the 2 books that she had.
At least 2. It might have been 3.
2. I think it was 3, but I didn't look at the middle book.
Yeah, we don't remember what the other one was though. So it's lost to the annals of history, I'm afraid.
It might as well have been.
Yes, I would have. I think it's highly likely I would have recognized it, but
she did have a Bible out there. She did have a Bible out there. That's right. I don't know why I didn't.
Well, that would be her ultimate default source. And anyway, the 2 books that you did notice were both ones that were old, familiar ones to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. And we're like we said, we're pretty sure she's not reading those. She probably has only, if she has opened them at all, very cursorily read the material. Nothing. She has not gone. She's not on the websites and whatnot.
I think it's more likely, as I said before, it's more likely for her church group or her church to have sponsored these classes to.
Let me go. I'll dash away from the camera for just a moment because I'll go get the show and tell because I've got the Taylor book and I think it'll be amusing for people to actually see that one. Back in a flash.
Absolutely. We'll distract you with our juggling skills in the meantime.
That was nerdy.
There it goes. Oh goodness, there it is.
The way she was dressed also was just like Sunday best.
Yeah, it was.
Like people in our town wear so.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Millie agris. Oh, that's some kind of species in genus, I would imagine. Millie agris felis. Yeah, you're right. We have no idea what the reasoning is for that. It's just something I've seen on creationist sources from Answers in Genesis. But there was Jerry Coyne once said that God's all powerful. Why didn't he just shrink all the animals down to the size of chickpeas and put them on the ark?
That's kind of adorable to think about.
Yeah, I don't know why I didn't just go with that method. If they're good people, but when you don't know your own religion, believe I'll be a member at all. She was dressed to advertise. I don't know, Peter. I don't know if it's against that kind of thing. What specifically? She was just wearing just normal clothes. She was just, all the vendors were just wearing like nice clothes. Sunday best.
Most of the vendors were wearing like jeans and a t-shirt, but this lady was dressed in clothes like you would go to church on a Wednesday night in.
Okay.
The first guy,
A
the guy who
regular,
sold me
yeah.
the trilobite was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He was.
Whew.
And also the
This, I believe,
people at the booth
is
where I
what
got
you
my
had seen there.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
The Great Dinosaur Mystery Solved. Of all
So
the
it's-
stupid books for her to have, it would have been this one from 1987. This was the early stages of your wackaloon young Earth creationist breed. There's a beautiful picture of Adam and talking with a little
He's wearing
dinosaur.
sunglasses almost.
And
It looks like he's been
Oh, was
standing
that?
in a salon.
Hey, RJ.
examples of here's Beowulf killing off a brontosaurus.
Oh, that's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's a picture for Noah's Ark of a Tyrannosaurus Rex drowning, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, it's
It was
the
quite
basic
funny.
lore and badly documented. The problem is that that's the viewpoint of young Earth creationists to this day, and they've produced a little bit more glossy illustrations, but it's still the same claptrap. And I went into it in quite a lot of detail in the Dinomania chapter in at hashtag tip. Everybody can download that bloody little thing if you want to get a rib tickler view world of Paul Taylor, Paul S. Taylor. There's two Paul Taylors, and he's
there
the
was
one of them.
was that, I think I saw a picture in that book when you opened it. Was that a like Centausaurus, or however you pronounce it, the hadrosaur from China? Which is funny because they don't actually think it looks like that anymore. It's like the first one they found, like part of the crest was missing, and so they misconstrued like how it looked.
Yeah, here's a beautiful picture of your standard pterodactyl flying over the pyramids. It's all it repeats lore about cryptozoology and supposedly evidence that Herodotus saw pterodactyls, and it's just terrible secondary scholarship that even your modern day creationists. Remember, this book was written 30 years ago. It's pretty antiquated from there. They've had to basically disown some of the older stuff and come up with new claptrap to replace the old claptrap, but they still functionally have to have on Noah's Ark. And since the whole point of the Ark was to preserve things, they really have to have dinosaurs surviving the Ark. So their lure of believing in cryptozoology and thinking that there really are brontosauruses traipsing around in Africa and that there are stegosaurs wandering around in Cambodia in the 12th century.
Oh,
and,
yeah. From the R and Rod did a breakdown of that, of like the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, it's forced on them by the ideology. Now, you'll notice they're very selective about their critters. So there's nobody wandering around trying to argue that there were Dimetrodons or Sphenacodonts or some of these other extinct lines of therapsids traipsing around somewhere that have survived the Ark. They don't really bother too much about that. And they can't even quite figure out in detail what the kinds of dinosaurs were, as well as all of those other vertebrates that all in that big map of time that they can't quite figure out. In the other book that you saw, we've apparently identified as Ken Ham's Revised Answers book. That Ken Ham doesn't really write all that many books, and so he tends to be sort of semi-collaborator with the people that actually do the writing part. He's kind of like
a different person.
He sort of takes credit for people in the same way. If you are familiar with that Turkish creationist Harun Yahya, or as I would be describing it with, he's a kind of a wackaloon right-wing nutball who started out briefly siphoning young Earth creationist stuff and then very quickly got off of that and now exclusively siphons intelligent design material. But he really doesn't do any of the work himself. He has a whole team of unpaid who actually assemble the websites, and book after book after book. I mean, he vomits these things out. He's got dozens of websites, all under varying names, and you can always identify them as a Halloween site.
Yeah, I saw one that was talking about it was making the argument that, evolution can't be true because there's too much variation in the number of chromosomes among mammals, for instance.
Yeah, yeah, which is balderdash, and it's fun to try to track down his secondary-itis, because the people that are copying tropes off of intelligent design literature but never fact-checking any of it, and you can usually identify how the daisy chain go because they'll copy it slavishly. So they'll have exactly the same references and exactly the same quote with the dot, dot, dots in exactly the same place that can track down who's copying from whom. Originality is not in their great suit. And the lady that you encountered in there, she's, I'm sure, absolutely sincere, assuming that all of this stuff is true. They may have had a preacher or creationist. There's an awful big network of creationists that go around grassroots. They're ones that aren't figuring as high up on the food chain as Answers in Genesis, who do these things as little cottage industries. And they're basically secondary citers who then repeat the material they copied from somebody else, and then they will present it in their little PowerPoint, and then these people will be hearing the thing. So they borrowed 2 of the books that they had, both of them old and I'm sure not fact-checked.
Oh yeah, there was a So there was actually well, that reminds me first before I get back to the Jim and Mineral Show story. There's a guy I used to talk to. Remember Ivan?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Jesus Talks guy here. We were talking. I was trying to explain to him that evolution is true, and so he gave me a secondary source. Of course, he couldn't find me a primary source, but I've told you about it before. The chemist James Tour. It's this article that he wrote on how no one understands macroevolution. Of course, he doesn't ever tell you what macroevolution actually means. He just says
a bloody chemist. You know about macroevolution tour.
Yeah, it's like it's just totally absurd.
He's one of those in the intelligent design wing. He's not a young earth creationist. I love these people that just go cherry picking. They go into a field that they're completely unsuited for, and they then rely, as far as I've been able to tell from any of Tour's stuff, he hasn't a hell of a lot of material up. He's gone no deeper than just reading intelligent design people and deciding it's true. I mean, this is not a guy who has dived into the role of bone morphological protein gene in the reptile-mammal transition. It's just not his forte. But anybody that's got a fid in after their name is fair game if they come out on the right side, because here he is a scientist and he has done work on chemistry and he is published and he is telling us that he is skeptical of Darwin, and we're not going to look any farther on it. But yeah, Tour is one of these long lines. In the physics realm, the late Fred Hoyle was a classic example of somebody who was a brilliant physicist who got his head up his ass because he just couldn't accept the idea of the Big Bang. He coined the term as an insult, by the way. And he also was an anti-evolutionist who just had a weird mishmash of notions. He thought the bubonic plague was an alien organism that came from outer space. I mean, this is just a strange set of stuff. And I would contend that if you look at it from a source methods direction, somebody like a Fred Hoyle and somebody like a James Tour are operating at exactly the same level of the kind of squishy, generic, really clutter up their heads too much with what the hell they think happened. And Tour falls into that category. Anyway, back to the rock show, especially in the part that you had to fill the dead air time while I was going to hunt up the damn book.
That's all right. We were just reading the comments in the chat, in the live chat, and so after the point where I asked her, she just ignored biogeography, genetics, embryology, and the fossil record. She said, no, the fossil record doesn't show evolution. There's no evidence of transition from apes to humans, which I said in and of itself is a biased statement because you're implicitly assuming that humans aren't apes. And so then I explained to her, I said, well, what about Sahelanthropus, Orin, Ardipithecus, Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, antecessor? And she just kind of basically brushed all of these off. She just kind of frowned at me, but
deer in the headlight look.
Yeah, she just kind of frowned at me and then said, well, we don't see anything. We don't see species to species change in the fossil record, to which I had to explain fossilization is a very rare process. Fortunately, the ocean preserves things a lot better than the land does, which is why we have a fantastic biodiversity of foraminifera, for instance, and explained that you know, we find these very basal forms, and then they get more and more complex the later in time we go. It's very gradual evolution, and so it was just she looked fairly upset by that point. So
She was
Well,
very flustered.
yeah, she was very flustered.
it's not unexpected, because if you know how anti-evolutionists deal with speciation, you will discover that they're all flustered by speciation, that none of them study it in detail. There's virtually none of the technical literature that gets discussed in the anti-evolution literature, so they're 900 miles away from the data set. And literally no anti-evolutionist ever conceptualizes what the hell a speciation event ought to look like in the fossil record, or for that matter in a living organism. And since they don't have that in their own brain, any evidence that you bring up is just going to be bouncing off of this "no, it can't be" argument. So what, from a methods point of view, to illustrate that, it would have been with her, would have been to say, well, what would a transitional form look like between an ape and a human, and how does it differ from the ones we actually find? Well, she probably doesn't know any of the ones they've actually found that you listed off. Yeah, and so, yeah, which we already have. But how would it look different? And that's the one where you would be demonstrating the fact that they'd never thought about this problem. I did the same thing. It's a different class of animal, but it's the same phenomenon with Jonathan Wells in person. I had to write off to him because I wanted to pin him down on what a transitional form would look like between a bird and a reptile, and how would it look different than Archaeopteryx. So I was framing it very carefully so that he wouldn't regard me as an anti-creationist and therefore circle the wagons and become defensive on it. So I was framing it in a very generic way for him to explain effectively as data. And finally, I got a letter back from him, and boy, did he give me more than I asked for, although it was everything I expected. He was saying, oh, I've never thought about that. But Archaeopteryx is a bad example of a transitional form. Jonathan, please, we're trying to move beyond Archaeopteryx. You know, let's posit for the sake of argument, Archaeopteryx isn't transitional. What would a perfect intermediate look like? He literally had never thought about that, and you couldn't get him to think about it. And it's not unique. Fail at this. They never conceptualize this in their own head. So your lady there was just par for the course, except she has fewer footnotes than Wells.
Yeah, Savannah was trying to keep me from being too caustic towards the lady.
Oh, that's my job, Savannah. I'll be caustic.
I was yeah, because she handed us the paper. She handed us these two papers, one with a list of creation scientists, as that's the same thing as scientists who believed in creation, even though not all of them on the list did. But beside the point. So then she gave us another paper that said, name three physicists who
to which
believe.
Jackson initially said, no, thank you.
Name three physicists who believe in creationism. Name three chemists. Name three biologists. Is like a worksheet you'd fill out in like elementary school. That's the kind of stuff.
And like that would make a difference. Of course, had I seen the list, fairly familiar list
on here.
Yes. Pasteur is a particularly fun one because he was not a non-evolutionist. And in fact, he was non-committal on evolution, but he never at any point criticized it. And one of the things that you could be pretty sure of is if the scuttlebutt was that Pasteur was down on evolution, Mr. Pitbull Thomas Huxley, or for that matter, Mr. Pitbull Alfred Wallace, go after them, because they routinely did, scientists at the time who were snarking at Darwin, and Darwin had a high opinion of Pasteur. So it's extremely unlikely that he was an anti-evolutionist. He just didn't like to think a heck of a lot about it and didn't bother too much about it. But there's this tremendous need to have the great people of science on their side, and that the people who are on the opposite side can't really be all that great. So it's got to be, in fact, just recently, I think David Klinghoffer or somebody at the Intelligent Design Bunch was snarking as to how Darwin wasn't nearly as great a scientist. Chafee, I think it was. Darwin is not nearly as great a scientist as Louis Agassiz was. And I'm going, oh, come now. Let's get a grip on this kind of stuff. It's the phenomenon. club aspect. It's not a popularity contest. You have brilliant people who believe all sorts of things. You have brilliant people who believe cockamamie stuff in the sciences for a while, but eventually the data wills out and people move on beyond that. So I could care less. I insist at the time. You know, if you go back farther, someone like Sedgwick, who was one of the founders of modern geology, he was a devout Christian and a cleric. He was not an evolutionist. He didn't like Darwinism at all, and to his dying day, he was
Lyle
fine
is a Christian too.
geologist. Yeah, and Lyle, he also reveals a lot of the things, is that he was sort of semi-evolutionist because he couldn't quite get over the idea that human beings had a heritage. And he was also more politically conservative than Darwin in many respects. And he was kind of okay with Southern slavery. He was a sympathizer with the aristocrats in the United States at the same way as the aristocrats were in Britain. And so this is complicated issues. And I have found that my little measure, conservative religious, is the defining characteristic of an anti-evolutionist, applies virtually universally across all the time frames. That if you look at anti-evolutionists in the 19th century, they are very politically conservative. They will be more monarchists than Democrats. They will dislike the foreigners. They will have a lot of the same obsessions on racial equality and other things that people have today. And so that culture war, political conservatism, religious conservatism, and you have to have all three of those. If you look at somebody like George Will, who is a politically conservative guy who's skeptical of global warming, but he's not religious, so he lacks that motivation, and he's not anti-evolutionist. So you can find maybe 3 or 4 people who don't fall into this category. Michael Denton is apparently an agnostic. He's in the design camp. Richard Milton is a non-religious, functional young Earth creationist. Wow. A minor player on the field. I didn't think it was possible. I thought he had to be religious when I first discovered him, because he was basically arguing young Earth creationism, but it turns out nope. And as soon as I started analyzing how he does his source methods, for those of you out in video land who have no idea who the hell I'm talking about, Richard Milton, he's about my age. He was, at least until recently, head of the British Mensa magazine. So he's one of these smart people who can do little rotation puzzles, but apparently can't figure out how old the Earth is. And if you look at how he approaches a data set, I discussed him a lot in Dynamania. You discover that he's my poster child for scholarly incompetence. He's unbelievably credulous and accepts stuff from young Earth creationists without ever fact-checking any of it. He's just terrible. He gets numbers off by orders of magnitude. He's just an amazing character. He's a very minor player, though. Nobody cites him much.
I really wish that when I read her list, one of the names was the great Carolus Linnaeus, and I wish I had gotten to explain to her how Linnaeus tried to set out a system of kinds, but realized humans were too close to chimps and the other apes, so he
put in the family primates. Yeah.
So he gave them their own category called Ponginae, and so or Pongidae. He gave them Pongidae, and so then had to set us apart from them. I wish I would have loved to explain that to the lady, because that would have put her through a loop, I think. It's like, hey, these creationists who were already trying to the first people to look at our relationship to other organisms were not evolutionary biologists. They were creationists. You know, trying to jive things with the Bible, and it didn't work for them. Of course, Linnaeus would never remember that.
I alluded to a bit of it in, I think, tip 1.4. Everybody should read my damn stuff. I've done all this damn homework. Pay attention to it. Anyway, on the history of the science discoveries that were popping up in the 19th century. And one of the things that was just becoming a crisis in any attempt to do a non-evolutionary taxonomy is that there were just so many animals they were discovering. It went from about a few hundred species that were known in biblical times to suddenly 1,000, and then 10,000, and 50,000, and 100,000, and 200,000. Every damned explorer that went out, it wasn't just Darwin, they would bring home specimen after specimen after specimen, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it wasn't just animals, it was plants. And then the microscope people were finding all these bacteria and more things in plants. We can't explain it. It's not in the Bible. Darwin comes along at just the right point, And suddenly, natural branching phylogeny. Oh, the patterns that you were seeing in nature now make sense. Asa Gray, who was a plant guy, before all of his work was just vague. And suddenly it's like a door opens up. We're seeing lineages. We're seeing natural branching lineages. Now we know why plants are where they are. Now we know why they're looking the way they are and why they have the fossil record that they do, because we're seeing the snapshots of a chronological framework. And all those sciences began to pick off. And when you look at those great names of Christian creation scientists, they're all peripheral. They're either people in physics or chemistry or magnetism and other things. They're physical sciences. They're not biological fields. Or if you look at the ones that are alive now, and there are some, there are creationists and intelligent designers who do science work. But boy, these are not the cutting edge people. These are not the big league paleontologists. They're not the cutting edge people in genetics. They're ones that operate in their little niche, and they can whittle their data set down to where it looks all designy. But the people that are doing the kick butt work, they're all evolutionists. Jump in before I talk too much.
Well, we were just looking at the.
May I answer this out loud?
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm a major, and I'm starting hopefully what will become 2 minors in Arabic and German.
I'm just a biology guy.
Yes, the Arabic is an absolutely magnificent choice, because that is a language that is, for better or worse, going to be one that having knowledge of that will be of great use in working our way through the rest of this century without blowing us up.
Yeah, I'm just a biology major on the other hand.
My
not going for any minors.
grandmother,
just a bio, but boy, you know your taxa, kid.
Who, me?
He definitely does.
Yeah, I'm telling her. We were actually trying to figure out earlier today what kind of corridors we have. We've got a whole bunch of fish tanks, and 2 of them like they're gonna mate, and so we were trying to figure out.
Hopefully they'll mate.
We think they're leopard catfish, because they have the 3 spotted catfish, because they have the 3 lines of spots going down their sides. So we think that's what they are. They're hanging around each other quite a lot. But yeah, I try
astonishing
to keep
range of animals that go, especially with fish that sometimes you can find that you're talking about a subspecies or a cousin or whatever. It's a sobering thing to realize just how broad the range of life is that you can't contain in a fish tank.
Yeah, I try to keep apprised of taxa, because a lot of times when I'm doing research for my my books or whatever, or if it's for fish that I'm getting, I try to keep in my head who's related to who, and things like that. There was when I was researching for my book, I was very intrigued to find that gars and beachers, bichir, and paddlefish are all really closely related to the. They're all like right next to the split between actinopterygians and sarcopterygians, and so these gars and paddlefish, all these guys, they have the vestiges of lungs. Of course, why the heck would fish need lungs if they're in water? Why the heck would they need these vestiges?
Where the swim bladder comes from in the teleosts.
Yeah. So
yeah, there's been a huge amount of material on here where part of the problem that 19th century non-evolutionists had was the fact that they were looking at superficial structures or what they could see in a microscope, because now we have the genetics and they're looking at so much greater detail on things that they can work out that sometimes things that looked kind of similar actually had much more revealing deep biology to them. And there's probably been more work done on the evolution of lung systems and the things that lead to the swim bladders off that line in the teleost fish that pop up in the Cretaceous than would have been the case even 20 years ago. So that's the neat thing about a network of the people doing the work stuff on Twitter and on video feeds and these various other connections is to have a set of scholarly spider webs that extend out to give us tripwires so that we can keep at the cutting edge of stuff, because the field moves so quickly and there are so many journals. I've got like 1,600 technical journals in my reference bibliography. That's more than there are signatories to the Discovery Institute Descent from Darwin, just the technical journals. And so nobody can follow all of that stuff on their own. But if you have a network of tendrils and people looking at the cutting edge material collectively, it's relatively easy to keep track of an awful lot of incoming material.
Well, you know the whole herd of cats analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is so unfortunately true. As it was with the club that I joined last year. Of course, I think most of them were seniors anyways. I joined a humanist agnostics club called AHA. Basically dissolved by the third meeting. It was it.
Yeah.
That was it. It just dissolved.
Well, even at Eastern, we've had groups where you actually will have just an activist or two that come in and they act as a stimulus and the club does stuff and then they graduate and then blah, 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 it starts falling apart. That's kind of an inevitable structure of probably what goes on in the atheist brain, that we aren't clubby. We aren't the sort that takes leaps of faith. We don't do that kind of secondary altruism kind of connections that people who have a religious perspective or political perspective, for that matter, do relatively easily. That puts us at kind of a disadvantage. Theoretically, we're supposed to learn from experience and we're clever and we're evidence-based. So how can we train our brains to do what we don't normally do? Well, in some cases, you can't. The brain can override. And on a completely irrelevant issue, how many are all geared up for the eclipse tomorrow?
I actually have class at that time, 12:30 to 1:30.
I do too.
Yeah, well, I've got my timer set, so it'll wake me up at 9 so I can get up, because it's hitting here about 10:30 in the morning, and then I'm recording. ABC is doing live coverage of it on their feed, and then Nova is going to be doing a recap show on their show for that night, where they're going all over the place on it. And apparently, I guess Louisville, Kentucky is one of the few places that is actually one of the largest cities that's on the actual totality strip. And of course, there's been panic. Some of the people in our networks have been following. They've been driving around trying to find a spot that doesn't have a zillion cars all packed up, and everybody is heading into Oregon and southern Idaho, and it's just jammed solid. It's just ridiculous. But we'll be 90% totality here in Spokane, and I'm going to make. I've got my NPR little jiffy pinhole camera set. You just take a piece of paper and you cut a little hole out of it, and you take some tin foil and you tape it over the hole, and that gives you a nice solid little thing to go boop with a little pin to make a tiny little pinhole. And then I will hopefully be able to use my driveway, which runs east to west, as a white surface to be able to observe it with my little pinhole camera, and as the sun goes almost dark here, because I didn't even bother. I don't have any money to go buy special glasses and all of that. But there's apparently going to be another one in 2045 or so, and I'll only be 93 then. If I can stay alive, my family had enough longevity that I think I can probably manage that one. So I may be able to stick around for another one. And of course, we'll be waiting to see the flat earthers to be able to predict the next thing from their well-developed theories of flat earth cosmology that we all cover so much. But anyway, I digress on that. The thing the take home that I'd like to have people have on your interaction at the rock show is that there are going to be creationists and intelligent design advocates, various people, and people who have all sorts of world beliefs that you'll find in all sorts of contexts outside of the might bump into them in a church or in some other context. And it's always good to interact. You want to have as much knowledge as you can, always want to be civil, but a certain amount of pushback and documentation to be able where you're actually paying attention to what you're seeing there and bringing it into the network. There will be people in that network that will be able to clarify what it is you saw and bring hopefully even larger context to it that you wouldn't have had just on your own.
Yeah,
I know you're looking at the
Yeah, we are looking at
comments
the
on the
big
side
groups
thing.
that are like that. But it's unfortunate that there are so few people out there battling the creationists and the evangelicals who come around and yell at people that they're gonna burn forever, which is actually what we want
Well,
to work on in the future. We were talking about. Usually, I go at it with the
Main whoever,
with
the
the main
loudest guy.
the main guy and his peeps stand around and watch while it happens. But we were thinking that next time we would try to talk to the people our age, see if maybe we could get through to them, because we're obviously not going to get through to him.
mm-hmm.
So that's what we were thinking about.
Well,
that.
one of the approaches that I would have, and this is why it's useful to have several people involved, is say you show up and somebody else, and one of you at least has a camera or the cell phone thing, and make sure that it's got good batteries and so forth so you can do the live stream. And here you go, oh gosh, you see this table. Person recording your interaction with somebody else. So if you got 3 people, it's even easier. And they're saying, wow, this is fascinating. And you ask a few questions, and you are very polite, and you're asking, oh, what sources do you have and how do you check them? And you're looking at the Ken Ham book, and you're looking at the Taylor book, and you go, Taylor's, oh, that's an old one from the 1980s. Yeah, these pictures, it's fascinating. Look at all of this stuff. And you can actually be commenting on that, and the person is recording this. You aren't the person at the booth, you're commenting upon the works that they're presenting.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that for like 5 minutes or so, and that's probably about a good length to do that kind of thing. You can then, or if you have longer, you can edit down to make kind of a little presentation. And what you can use it, you're not trying to persuade the person at the table that they're wrong. That ain't going to happen. But what you are trying to do is to bear witness about the data. Watching that, then can also see that if they encounter a similar sort of thing somewhere else, they're going to presumably have more ammunition and more understanding. Instead, if they saw that Paul Taylor book that's 30 years old, that's older than you are, how would you have any knowledge about how it fits into a larger context unless you had done the study on it? Or you could read my material at Troubles in Paradise, and you would have found out a bit about that as well. So that would have given you a context on it. And the more people know about these things to where they're not blindsided by them. That if you go to a creationist booth and you see 2 books and you have no clue who they are, them out, and that means you're out of your depth. But whereas if you see Ken Ham and you go, I know all about Ken Ham, Paul Taylor, oh, Paul Taylor and his brother Paul F, and all of the little Taylor clan and how they had done stuff. Now you have a level of armament, not blindsiding, and probably that you know more about their side than they do. That the poor woman at the table will never have necessarily even bothered reading the text. That's why it would have been important to have asked her, did she actually read the material all the way through? And if she has, did you fact check it? Yeah, there we go.
I feel that maybe because she didn't know it, and because I was just vomiting words at her, maybe she would have the interest to look up these things on the internet. Or you don't think so?
Yeah.
You don't think so?
No. Follow up. If somebody, you have to understand how the secondary source addict works, and we can take all the way up at a high food chain level. Somebody like Dinesh D'Souza, who's somebody that you and I both despise, and for good reason. But he's operating at exactly the same level. He's an apologetic secondary source addict. He sees something that he wants to be true, that he's happy with. He will then link to it, and that's as far as it goes. For her perspective, I predict that if you had probed, probably not read either one of those books closely, she would not have bothered to do any follow-up research. She wouldn't really have a sense about how old they both were, or that new material had been coming up. And 2, if you're coming from a religious perspective where proof texting is the mode, once something becomes true, it can never not be true.
Savannah.
Somebody supposedly proves the absolute truth of evolution being wrong. It doesn't matter what happens afterwards. That becomes a fixed object. So they can cite older material. Sometimes you'll find not even mentioning dates and all the rest. To know their background better than they do is the toughest thing to do. But we've got to, because we have people who believe exactly the way that woman probably does, and they are secretaries in the Trump administration.
Savannah
And
wants
they're going to be making laws for people using exactly the same methodology. Oh, I suppose I should look over here at
also
ha ha ha, and yet
Savannah's
RJ
on the-
sounds the same.
I think that regardless of, I don't know whether or not she can comprehend what you're going to say, it's more of a question of, even if she were to truly be able to sit down and have a conversation with you, or truly look it up on her own, if she came to the conclusion that evolution was true and that threatened her ideology, as it were, then would she care to investigate more, or would she wipe it off of her mind? I think as an older woman as she was, her family and her community already established within a Christian background. So regardless of what she may start to think about, she's not going to push anything far enough as to where it would threaten her social scene or her community, you know? And I think that's one of the reasons why
I'm convinced
talking to the younger kids interests me so much, because they're around our age and they've obviously grown up in whatever religion this is.
That Pentecostal background, it's a.
What you're trying to do in a way.
I know Arden Ra does a video, or he
jump in.
talks about it, where he says when you start doing research in that area, you have a choice to either stay honest or stay creationist. So
the methods direction is such. See, I believe that people are not creationists because they're religious. They have a Tortucan mind. Religion is what they want, and the creationism is something they like. They have a mind that can filter the data stream beforehand. And other people who believe completely different things, cognitive architecture. So when you're dealing with young people, what you're dealing with is actually you're trying to measure how Tortucan they are. If there are people who are by nature ones that will try to fact check material, if they will take things provisionally and try to investigate and read as much as they can on it, that's probably a mind that will be much less likely to be amenable to propaganda at any level. And they'll be just as likely to be questioning the material they find in anything. If you have a mind that can easily confuse primary and secondary sources, think about things and not investigate sources, then you can slide into all sorts of belief systems easily. If you happen to come from a religious frame, that's another matter. So my suspicion is that doctrinization is not that critical. If somebody has a non-Tortucan mind, as soon as they get out in the real world, they're going to find the data stream, and they're going to just change their mind and drop it off like an old coat. If they have a Tortucan mind, to the data all they like, but it's not going to matter. And the thing that we do know from a long history of anti-evolutionism is that people changing their minds are not things you see a lot. And the ones who do tend to change their minds are the ones who were raised in it. In other words, they're more likely non-Tortucans who were simply raised in that framework. They accepted it as true, and then they got out in the world and went, oh, whoa, oh, geology, okay, whoop, and then drop it off. You find relatively few people who come into this late in life because they have a Tortucan mind to begin with. Philip Johnson is an example. He didn't become an anti-evolution advocate until quite a bit late. That's where you can get some people who were, I was an atheist and then I become a creationist. Well, yeah,
well,
but
it's
the methods.
It's actually very fun. It's very funny we brought that up. I was actually talking about the Touchstone Museum earlier, which, so, the whole taxidermy stuff, and you don't know it's creationist until you go up to the second floor, and then you see the whole, Darwin denounced his own theory, it's blah, 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 or it's 6,000 years old. There's the poster that says, I was a evolutionist for 30 years before I found God. And so, there's a lot of stuff like that. We actually met a guy.
With Truth on Display.
Yeah, this group called Truth on Display. I always forget their name. Where it's like it's a younger guy in his early 20s, and then an older guy who was at least 30s.
He was kind of old.
Maybe 40s.
Oh, I love the description of somebody in the 30s or 40s as an older guy. Anyway, continue.
She said it, not me. It wasn't me, I swear. But he made the claim that he taught psychology, which that he was the president of the Atheist Club before he became a Christian.
Did. Jackson mentioned the Atheist Club here, which he was a part of. And he said,
Yeah.
"Oh, I was a president of a club like that."
Yeah, he said he ran the
Could
Atheist
very
Club.
well be true. Could it indeed very well be true?
That's
That
what
if you
I
look
said.
at some,
That's what I've
if
always
you
said.
look
I
at
said,
somebody
we
like
have no idea whether or
Thomas
not what he
Nagel,
says is true. So
Thomas Nagel is the current poster child of the famous atheist who became a convert, sort of, kinda, at the end of things, and when he was now a decrepit old man about ready to die. But the issue is, was he that clear of a reasoner earlier? I don't presume that just because somebody is an atheist that they have necessarily a razor-sharp mind or that they have sound methodology.
Right.
And in fact, I'm always leery to say Bertrand Russell as too big of a poster child, because he's a fascinating character, but boy, he's got roadblocks in his mind that are as big as a truck to drive through. And he was a homophobe,
or are they just
a Marxist who never could say anything bad about the Soviet Union. He was a quirky little fellow and a brilliant mind, but yeah, I don't need him to have a skepticism.
Bertrand Russell, was that the guy in the early 1900s who did he did a lot of stuff with math, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was the guy who didn't like Gödel. Bertrand Russell, in many ways, he had a messianic belief in the absolute unity of mathematics, that you could have you could discover everything in mathematics rigorously without any problems. And Gödel told him, sorry, you can't. All logical systems have undecidable propositions. This was in the 1920s. And Gödel was right and Bertrand Russell was wrong, poor little schlump. That he had his limitations. He's also famous for the teacup, the teapot in space, that you can't prove God. And it's actually a terrible analogy, because theoretically you could build a teacup that would be able to detect porcelain at a micron scale and put up fleets of orbiting satellites to detect the orbiting teapot in a way that you can't do gods. And that's, ironically, he was underestimating the ability of technology to do things. I mean, we can use telescopes now to look at the atmosphere of planets in Alpha Centauri. So,
well, I mean, in his own time, it probably seemed like a good analogy.
And so he's a fun one. The same way H.G. Wells is another fellow who has his upsides and his downsides. And another one currently alive, Noam Chomsky. Boy, he's a third rail as far as I'm concerned. I try not to rely on him as an authority quote, because he's...
sorry, go ahead.
Noam Chomsky is as big of a Tortugan as Ken Ham is. He has a blind spots in his mind. He has a very rigid ideology. He pops up on if you want to have a totally different version of Noam Chomsky, read Susan Jacoby's Age of American Unreason, which is about a whole bunch of weird people in our current times. It's a fairly recent book, and Noam Chomsky got a whole bloody chapter. Primarily for his denial of the Cambodian Holocaust during the 1970s.
He denies the Khmer Rouge?
Oh, yeah. Oh, he was constantly saying, oh, no, they haven't killed millions of people. No, this is propaganda from the West. And besides, we did far worse in Guatemala and blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, I fact-checked and source-checked the material on there. And it's like you're going, okay, yeah. Well, Chomsky had already come on my scope because of creationism. He's an evolutionist who you could never quite figure out how he thinks language evolved. And he was just incredibly vague, and he was always the creationist.
He did a talk with Lawrence Krauss about that, where he actually explained it.
Well, sort of, kind of. Lawrence Krauss also, he studied under Chomsky, and boy, talk about a love fest. Whoa. Anyway, the thing is that the neuroscience people who are getting into this language evolution issue have just basically bypassed him, and he's operating from a highly theoretical framework. But anyway, the creationist, he was always the favorite linguist to quote, because he would be talking about innate language and it fits in with the creationist dogma. So ever since the 70s and 80s, he's just been quote mine heaven for him. And so I was already looking at him from that spot. Paul Ehrlich, the environmentalist, also pops up as quote mines because of some of the things he had been saying about evolution and speciation back in the 80s. You know, just zip it, Paul. Anyway, he then pops up then on Susan Jacoby's thing, and then I started looking at him more as a Tortugan mind, because he has things he wants to be true, And I don't know if you've heard of the Romanian poet. He pops up on NPR every once in a while. He's getting quite old, but he's from down in your area. He lives down in New Orleans. A Ceausescu or something. I can never remember his name. And he's an absolutely charming, surrealist Romanian poet and social critic. He pops up once in a while. He was far more frequented on NPR 10 years or 15 years ago because he's getting older in that. But he still lives down.
I don't think we know him. We don't know him.
I can't think of his name, but it's like Nicolae Ceausescu or something like that. And that thing, anyway, he did a commentary on NPR. This would have been about 15 years ago, so it's easy for you to have not known about him. And I just roared in laughter because he was listening to a Noam Chomsky speech and a lecture, and he says, "Whoa, I can't listen to him for more than 5 minutes before I want to throw something at the radio because it's just driving me nuts. He's going off on the oppressed Palestinians and the American industrial complex. He's just as all a trope that he goes into." And I'm nodding my head, going, "Yep, same thing." He's just as rigid and thin in his analysis as Ken Ham is over in creationism land. He has a different set of axes to grind. But yeah, from a methodological perspective, he's fascinating. He's very calm, very reason-sounding. He's always very mannered, temper. Yeah,
you have to say
very
it's
sure
very funny. It's very funny that we brought up Noam Chomsky as being a Tortugan because I actually I respected his manufacturing consent, which I think he might be remembered for that. His manufacturing consent book. You've heard about that one?
Well, yeah, he's a lot of things he says are perfectly valid, but he also has a set of axes to grind and things that when push comes to shove, all true Scotsmen, all true leftists can't really do anything bad, and that's what got him into trouble with Pol Pot. Because he can easily see iniquity on the side of right-wing ideologues. He can see that at the drop of a hat. But boy, he had trouble dealing with Pol Pot and of course the whole Palestinian-Israeli thing has got tit for tat going on. You've got people who are sons of a bitches on both sides, and you've got terrible troubles where a plague on both your houses. You know, give the damn Palestinians access to water rights and stop trying to lob bombs over into Israel. I mean, let's just give, but they're unlikely to be able to get past that. And so although we get into the same problem when we're dealing with a lot of political ideologies back in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of people, you find it actually playing out now with Dinesh D'Souza, because you've got people today who are, he wants to paint the new alt actually fascists, literally. And so the true fascism of today, and the fascists were actually being promoted by the left-wingers in the 1930s, and he has this weird argument that he constructs by an astonishing amount of data selection, that methodologically, Dinesh D'Souza is doing about the same sorts of parsing games as the late Howard Zinn did, and also Noam Chomsky. So I know that he can be talking about any subject whatsoever, Noam Chomsky. And in 5 minutes flat, he's going to be talking about the oppressed Palestinians and the American industrial complex. He's got his little axes to grind. And in fact, David Niozzi, both.
I've actually come across him once before. I have heard of him once.
Yeah, both of them are big in the skeptic movement and the atheist movements. And I fielded this Noam Chomsky Tortugan model to them when I bumped into them when they were giving lectures. And both of them had the same reaction. They kind of go, I've had problems with him too, and because they would realize that there were difficulties with his kind of dogmatism and his tunnel vision on certain kinds of issues. And I'm just going, Tortugan alert, he's a brilliant mind. There are a lot of brilliant minds that are that way. You could see this all through science, and nobody's immune from it. I eat pork, and I know that pigs are very intelligent animals, and I just don't want to think about that. Thank you very much. I like my bacon. And so everybody has some. Brilliant Tortugans are the most dangerous because they're articulate. They offer very good evidence for their positions, and they're often tremendously persuasive people. They have big followings, and but when you start looking at the source base, that Pol Pot example was so fascinating because I've had to buy all 3 of the books where he had referred to these things over the years, because not one of them was in the library. A lot of Chomsky books are, but not these. So I managed to track them down. I bought them when I still had money. And I discovered how superficial his argument was. That he would be relying on some little newspaper account, and he would then use a weird and really sleazy manipulation game where he was saying, well, here's an account that says that maybe only 100,000 people were expelled from Phnom Penh based on this newspaper account. Can't possibly have been killing all these people because it was only a small number of people that were involved in this. And then by comparison, we were killing far more people in Guatemala through and he goes off on the juntas and our support of that. And this is same kind of addiction to superficial secondary sourcing that Dinesh D'Souza is doing when he's trying to dismiss global warming by citing somebody from the Heartland Institute that he links to secondarily. And if it's bad for Dinesh D'Souza to do that, it's bad for Noam Chomsky to do that. Plus, we got a whole damn pile of skulls there in Cambodia where we know that they killed off half the population. Examples of genocide in the 20th century, and that's with Nazi Germany and all the.
There's the well, speaking of people denying genocides, there was the was it the Armenian genocide that the young
Turks, yeah, the Turks to this day, it's fighting words in Turkey. They refuse to ever acknowledge that there was an Armenian genocide back, and it wasn't even under the Turkish government as we now know. It was under the damn Ottomans. But because they are so, the Japanese have the same problem with the Chinese over the rape of Nanking. The terrible things that they did in the 1930s just before the Second World War. That it's very tough. We have still problems, although we do it a little better than some, but we have terrible difficulties dealing with the troubles that we were putting on Native Americans and the amount of massacres and things we did in the broken treaties. This is a sorry state, plus slavery.
Yeah, my dad is a history teacher, and he showed me, what was it? Is there to be a map of like modern Native American reserves, and it's like, okay, he's telling me, all right, early Americans
take out the crap land and make the Indians live on it. Yes,
we're gonna let you have all this land. Okay, never mind, we're gonna let you have this land. Okay, never mind, we're gonna let you have this land. Okay, never mind, we're gonna take all that land from you now.
The irony with this proliferation of Native American gambling casinos is that now finally we're actually starting to live up to our damn treaty rights. And Indian nations are in a quasi-independent status. There are, I think the Mohawks in particular, they carry double passports. They have a United States passport and a Mohawk passport because technically they're a separate nation living inside the United States and they're crossover rights and all this kind of stuff. So on Indian reservations, they have their own police forces because they are not under the jurisdiction of whatever county in that they may live in. And it's whether we like it or not, it's the damn treaties, and we got to live up to what our treaties are. Well, you now have this thing where they have an avenue for gambling casinos that were bypassing gambling laws, and so we get the delicious irony of the descendants of people who may have stolen land from the Indians freely giving back the money at the gambling casino to that. So there's the irony of life. We have quite a few Indian casinos, the Coeur d'Alene Indian tribes and the Spokane Indians. They all run gambling casinos here, and they're very elaborate, and there's kind of like mini Las Vegases now, which is giving Las Vegas a run for its money. There, that in the old days, if you wanted to gamble legally, you had to go to Las Vegas or Reno, where it was legal in Nevada, and or Atlantic City, unless, of course, you were planning on going to Trump Casino, which was a short-lived phenomenon that is part of that business genius Trump's ability to lose money on a gambling casino. Anyway, I jump in on there. So I think busted the major thrust of the visit to the rock show and the Happy Little Creationists. We've been at it a little over an hour. Any further comments from the chat peanut gallery and or from our two young guests?
Yeah.
I'm good. How are you doing?
I think we said everything we remember pretty much.
Are you at least happy that you were okay with the fact that you joined in our discussion on this, where your face is being put, Savannah, out into the universe along with Jackson, and
I am
people are
absolutely
seeing things.
satisfied now that I've taken a nice shower.
You know, actually, it makes me wonder how long have they been putting up booths at the gym show?
Very good question. I would wager probably for years. And people would come by, and there would be people who were just like you who had just about the same reaction. Judging by how old the books were, been doing that for quite some time. You know, I mean, that one from the 1980s, that's not one that typically is in reissue much, although I think it still is available on a lot of the creationist education websites. I still see it popping up every once in a while.
I looked it up today. It was on like Christian Books or some website like that.
Christianbooks.com.
Yeah, Christianbooks.com. That was where Savannah looked it up earlier. But yeah, it was just makes you wonder. There's like, because this con has been going on for years, and I've been to it several times, and so it just makes me wonder. Have they always been there, hiding in the corner and lurking in the shadows?
They were also near the children's sandbox where they could dig up little toys and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite a strategic place to be.
Indeed, it is.
Yeah, and that's why what we do now in a communication network is so relevant, because we have no excuse now for not being able to document these things much better. I contend that if we have a well-operating network, that no creationist can poke their head up and not have us notice it. And where it's in a public venue that way, we have a perfect right to be able to press back. If it's in a thing where it's in a college setting where it's free and open to the public, or for that matter, at a church venue where it's free and open to the public, these are things that the more we document it, the more we can put it up in the light. And gradually, local people will know who connects with who. They'll figure out that, oh gosh, that person who's running for city council or school board is of the same church as the group that actually been posting at the creation thing. That puts in a different context things that relate to politics, things that would relate to people voting in primaries. And if people paid more attention to this, it's not that no creationist could ever get elected. If you have a district where most people are creationists, they would have no problem with it. But know about it beforehand, and you shouldn't be in a situation where people who have these attitudes slip under the radar because nobody was really paying attention to it. That's inexcusable in this day and age. Choice based on the information, fine, but they need to know the information.
I'll tell you though, next time we go, I will be on the lookout for them, because
I just never thought that a booth like that would be there. Like, yeah. I know we didn't even think
all
about
places.
it.
Yeah, we didn't think about it. We just, I would have never thought I'd see one of those there.
A lot of creationists would be rock lovers. They would be geology lovers. They would be nature lovers. A lot of the people that start up these little creation museums love the natural world, and they view it as an example of God's handiwork. So, and they've been raised on this creationist material. The fun part would be, in fact, this is an area that you can deal with in your own context, is to ask them, well, this flood, where's the flood here? Where's the flood layer here underneath the museum or where you live? So know the geology of your local area. I can deal with it in Spokane because as I tweet with people online, I'll say, describe the flood layer where you live. There ain't one here in Spokane. I'm on the Columbia Basalt. We've got like 12,000 years worth of debris that's come downstream since the Missoula flood stopped. And there certainly ain't no evidence of a grand global flood of the kind you're describing here. And so far, zero answers on this because they are not curious about their local environment. As I discuss in Dinomania, that was the thing that was so distinctive about the early geologists. From Nicholas Steno, who was a religious cleric who came up with the idea of superimposition, where the stuff that's on the top is probably younger than the stuff that's on the bottom. Duh. They were trying to explain their local neighborhood. There looked the way it did. Sicker Point, S-I-C-C-A-R, I did a whole mini video on it. There's a bunch of sources and stuff that you can link to on it. That was the one where Hutton, that weird little spot up in, yeah, isn't that a hoot, Sicker Point?
It was very interesting, yes. The basal conglomerates and all that jazz, very interesting.
Yeah, it's a weird layer cake of deposits and erosions and things layered up on top. So it's just this absolute jigsaw puzzle. And if you think about how long it would take to do each of the layer cakes and then tilting and then erosion and something else, it wasn't going to work for 6,000 years. And you'll find very little creationist discussion of Sicker Point.
We've actually, we got to go. We've actually got to head out.
Okay, yes, there we go. Thank you very much for the show. And I thought this was a useful subject to deal with, and I was pleased to talk you into it. And thank you all, because it's getting late there. And any of them watching from Europe, good God, it's practically time for the sunrise over there. And we have to remember it's eclipse at 10 o'clock our time here tomorrow. So thank you very much, and au revoir. We are concluding the broadcast.